Our keynote speaker for this evening is Dr. Kate Spradley. Dr. Spradley was principally in charge of the team that oversaw the Oakwood Cemetery archaeological investigation from the early stages of permitting and monitoring through the exhumation process and final report. Dr. Spradley received her master's degree from the University of Arkansas in 2000 and her PhD from the University of Tennessee in 2006. She is a biological anthropologist with specific research interests in human biological variation, forensic anthropology, bio-archaeology, and quantitative methods. She uses metric data from human skeletons to address identification methods in forensic anthropology, to track population migrations where there is little or no historical evidence. Her current research broadly addresses migration and sex and ancestry estimation with forensic anthropology using quantitative methods, and more specifically, her research addresses Hispanic identification issues. So please welcome Dr. Kate Spradley.
Hi, I'm Kate Spradley. I'm a professor of anthropology at Texas State University, and I'm a biological anthropologist, and I also work within the Forensic Anthropology Center at Texas State University. And I was contracted to conduct the bioarchaeological analysis of the remains that were exhumed from the Oakwood Historic Chapel. So I'm going to talk to you today about the process of analysis and what we learned from start to finish, how we built the biological profile, which includes estimations of population affinity, sex, age, how tall somebody was, any pathologies and trauma, along with some habitual activities that we've learned about a few individuals, and how this data compares to overall cemetery records and where we go from here. But before I get started, I'd like to thank the City of Austin Parks and Recreation Department for hosting this symposium and for inviting me here to speak today. I am going to take a moment just to tell you a little bit about Texas State University. You can see here it was established in 1899, but in 2009, it became a federally recognized Hispanic serving institution. And currently our student enrollment is majority minority. And as I'm going to discuss throughout this presentation, the individuals that were exhumed represent the diversity that was present in Austin during the mid to late 19th and early 20th century. And our students that assisted with the cleaning and analysis, including the lead graduate student analyst, also come from diverse backgrounds and consist of individuals who self-identified as Black, Hispanic, and Asian American. So here's a picture of our laboratory where these wooden tables are where the remains were cleaned and analyzed. And it is a secure access lab. It is not open to the general public. And if you are a student working in here, you have to meet our security clearance standards. This is also where the remains are currently being stored prior to reinterment. Our Forensic Center also has a willed body donation program for education and research, and we also serve the greater community by providing forensic anthropological analysis for unidentified human remains, and we do a lot of work with individuals who die crossing the Texas-Mexico border. So let's start here. This picture is of two burials from the Hicks Archaeological report that is publicly available. And I want you to look at the soil in this picture and how compact it is. This type of soil is difficult to dig in, and it's not conducive to good bone preservation. The report states that when remains were found, they appeared to be in good condition, but then upon further excavation, they became fragmentary. And these fragments were carefully wrapped up and transported to Texas State. So the first step for us then was to open all of these small packages of bone and begin the process to clean an inventory. For this, I would like for you to imagine that someone gave you a 1,000-piece puzzle, and each piece was encased in a dirt matrix, not the easy kind that's not the kind that's loose and easy to brush off, but the kind that you saw in the previous picture. And so imagine you have to clean every piece of this puzzle before putting it together. And you have to be careful cleaning it so that you don't damage the puzzle pieces, so you can fit it back together properly. This is what it was like to clean the remains of each skeleton. Every human skeleton has 206 bones, and every bone of every skeleton that was excavated at Oakwood was fragmented into multiple pieces. So this gives you 600 plus fragments, 600 to 1,000 fragments that have to be meticulously cleaned and reassembled before the analysis could begin. So this would take 2 to 3 weeks per individual, with multiple undergraduate and graduate students working on this process. And this process took the longest time. And people always ask, why does the analysis take so long? Well, it takes time to collect data and analyze data, but it also took a long time to clean these remains. So once the remains were cleaned, they were laid out in anatomical position to prepare for the analysis. These are line drawings from 2 of the individuals. One is an adult and one is an infant. You can see the fragmentary nature of these remains. There's portions of the remains that are missing due to poor preservation. For the adult, most of the arms and legs and hands and feet are present. You have a few ribs, a few vertebrae, a partial pelvis, a partial cranium, but most of the dentition. Enamel is stronger than bone, the enamel in your teeth, so it tends to preserve better. The infant has a few arm and leg bones and a few cranial bones. Some of the individuals had worse preservation and some of them better. So it was, for each one though, it was challenging to get the full amount of information out of them. Once the remains were laid out in anatomical position, we began collecting standard data. And we used a program called Osteoware that was developed by the Smithsonian Institution's Osteology Repatriation Laboratory. And it collects standard data as well as some additional data. This is a screenshot of the program. Once the data is entered into the program, it's stored in a database. So it's very helpful for curating the data as well as future analyses. And it just provides a very systematic way to inventory the remains and to collect dental data, pathology, and all other standard data in an easy format. And all of these data that were collected helps us to answer the question of who each individual represents. What is their sex? How tall were they? How old were they? What kind of life did they lead? So once the data was collected, we could then begin the analysis. And because the cemetery dated to the mid to late 19th to early 20th century, written records were available. And some of the methods that we use in our analysis are population specific, but also time period specific. So we wanted to get an idea specifically of who was buried in this cemetery and who the individuals represent that were excavated. So a few summers ago, we had a McNair scholar from Trinity University, Michelle Wynn, who interned with us. And she downloaded and compiled all of the cemetery records from Oakwood. They had been digitized and were available through the Austin Public Library. And we discovered that section 4, where the chapel was built, was referred to as the stranger's ground, or as it is called, the colored grounds. Here is an example of what these records look like. You can see that there are some individuals with names and some that are unknown. There is a racial category listed for each individual, and this gave us an idea of who was buried within this section of the cemetery, with the overwhelming majority, except a few, recorded as Black, white, or Mexican. So after learning the demographic makeup of the cemetery, I needed to find appropriate reference data to estimate the population affinity or the group membership for each individual burial. So to estimate population affinity, cranial measurements were used from each individual if they were possible to record, and those were statistically compared to appropriate reference groups. So individual measurements from an individual were statistically compared to the groups that you see here on this slide. And individuals that had more metrics had better or stronger estimations. Because of the fragmentary nature, it wasn't possible to get a full set of measurements. So some of the estimations are considered moderate, some of them are considered strong. And for individuals that had poorly preserved crania, we used dental metrics, so measurements from the teeth, and statistically compared these to broad population groups, including European, African, and Asian. So overall, the population estimates that you see here on this slide mirror the diversity in the cemetery records. Estimations were not provided for infants and children. They were too young, it was too fragmentary, and it's also not considered good practice to do so. Estimation of sex was conducted from visual and quantitative observations from the pelvis when it was present. Men and women exhibit differences in pelvic shape because women give birth and men don't, so they're different shapes. So we can look at these shapes and put this information into a statistical program to get a probability of male or female. When the pelvis was not available, we use measurements from the long bones, so the arms and the legs. Long bones provide good estimates of sex in absence of the pelvis because males, on average, are taller and larger than females, especially in joint sizes like shoulder, elbow, hip, and knee. And so most of the measurements we used included joint size. So you can see that of all the individuals excavated, the majority were male. Age estimate is pretty accurate in children, but is more difficult in adults. This is because aging children is based on sequential growth and development of bones and teeth, and aging in adults hinges upon degenerative changes within the skeletons. You can see on this hand X-ray, there are small growth plates, you can see. Small growth plates at the end of each bone. In the hand, and over time these grow together, so you can see the growth plates here and here and here, and they're all fused together here at 18 years old. So as children grow and develop, their bones and teeth form and erupt at specific rates. The teeth erupt at specific rates, the bones form at specific rates. So bone growth and fusion and tooth formation and development and eruption were used to estimate age for infants and children, and degenerative changes in the adult skeleton, particularly in the pelvis. The pelvis distributes upper body weight to lower body weight. It shows a lot of wear and tear. Pelvic architecture, as well as looking at the overall skeleton, provided a statistical estimation of age for adults. And adults are harder because other factors can influence age estimation as well. For example, a manual laborer can have more degenerative changes than someone who is a non-laborer, even though they might be the same age. So we're looking at broader ranges for adults and narrower ranges for children. Overall, of the adults, most were in the category of 21 to 45 and 46 to 75, with a few in the 75 plus. There are a high number of infants and children because infant mortality was high during this time period. This is what we expect to see in terms of infant mortality. Estimating stature, or how tall a person was, is most often conducted using mathematical formulae derived from the femur that you see here, the thigh bone, or other long bones or arm bones. Most of the remains were so fragmentary that estimates of stature were not possible. Stature is often used as an indicator of the overall well-being of a population. When times are hard, there's not enough to eat, people don't grow to their full genetic potential. You can see here that the tallest estimates for men include 5 foot 8 inches, and for females, 5 foot 5 inches. Although those are at the high end of the estimation, and likely they'd be a few inches shorter. The average height for American men today is 5'9" and 5'4" for women. So these heights are not that different than what you see today. All adults exhibited some level of tartar or calculus. About half had some level of periodontal disease with some destruction of the bone surrounding the teeth. A few had major abscesses that destroyed the tooth and surrounding bone. And abscesses, if left untreated, could ultimately lead to death during this time period. Most individuals exhibited cavities, some minor, some extreme, with total tooth destruction, but there's no evidence of any dental treatment for any of the individuals. Overall, there were not many pathologies noted. Older individuals had some age-related arthritis. None of it looked like it was due to any habitual activities or specific manual labor. There was a few instances of non-specific bone infections in the lower limbs, but overall, you don't see a lot of pathology. You see people that looked relatively healthy. There was some trauma in a few of these individuals, but overall, there wasn't a lot of trauma. Burial 9, a Black female, approximately 40 years old, exhibited 2 healed circular depression fractures, characteristic of blunt force trauma to the forehead. Burial 7, a Black male in his early 20s, exhibited a healed complete fracture to the middle of the femur, the thigh bone, and when it healed, it resulted in one leg being about a little over an inch shorter than the other. Burial 40, an adult male with population affinity could not be determined, had a complete fracture of the distal ulna, which is one of the the forearm bones, and it exhibited healing but with non-union of the bone, meaning the bones were healing but they did not reconnect. So these bone fractures that we see, especially in the femur and the ulna, it did not look like there was any medical intervention because of the way that they were healing. Childhood stress in the form of enamel hypoplasias, which are lines of disruption that you can see in the teeth. They are caused from systemic or physiological stress or childhood illness. Almost everybody in the Oakwood series had some type of hypoplasia. They were not dramatic, but it showed that at some point everybody's had some type of physiological stress. These manifest when the teeth are still growing during childhood, but they are a record of that childhood stress in the adult. In the past, people thought this has occurred from weaning, but it can be from other things, including just non-specific childhood illness. We did find some evidence of autopsies and trefanations. Burial 7, Black male in early 20s with the femur fracture, had evidence of an autopsy or dissection cut to the cranium. Burial 31, a white male around 40 years, had a trefanation, which is a circular cut from the tool that you see here. And this trefanation happened on or around the time of death. And there's no sign of healing. Trefanations are often used to release pressure on the brain when swelling occurs, and this is usually due to injury. However, there were no visible signs of injury, so this trefanning, although it could have been done to relieve pressure, it could have been done for purposes of practicing a trefanation. Burial 25, a Mexican male, approximately 30 years old, had some robust muscle markings on both tibia and femora, which are the shin bones and the thigh bones that have been associated with horseback riding or some other repetitive type activity. Burial 26, a Black male, approximately 50 years old, had signs of a pipe notch in his dentition from a clay pipe. You can see the circular area right here. The clay stem of a pipe, like you see here, is very rough. It's very gritty, and over time it acts like a file against the teeth, creating this circular notch that you see here. So a big question is, what did these individuals die from? None of the remains show obvious signs of disease or trauma associated with death. So during this time period in Texas, the leading causes of death were the diseases that you see here on the slide. And these are infectious diseases, and they don't leave any signs on bones. If you look at US mortality profiles from the 1900s forward, you can see that in the 1900s, infectious disease and non-infectious disease were both the leading causes of death. As sanitation improved over the years, as well as improvements in healthcare and nutrition, non-infectious diseases became the leading cause of death. Essentially, you see a decline in infectious disease, and non-infectious disease remains fairly flat. This slide was generated by Michelle Wynn, our McNair scholar from Trinity, and consists of all the individual records from the entire Oakwood Cemetery that had a listed cause of death. Infants and children and individuals in the 21 to 45 category make up the highest numbers of death. Infant mortality was high during this time period, so many individuals within the 21 and 45 year category are consistent with infectious disease as causes of death. With non-infectious disease, you would see more individuals living into older age. And again, infant mortality is very high during this time period. The mortality profile for the exhumed remains that you see here fits within the profile of the overall cemetery. Again, we see high infant mortality for the exhumed remains, with the majority of deaths in the 21 to 45 year categories. And the fact that there's no evidence of disease on these skeletal remains suggests that most adults likely died from infectious disease. So we started with skeletal fragments and ended with a bigger picture of who these individuals were and what they likely died from. Overall, these individuals from Oakwood represent the diversity of Austin's population during the time. So now it's time to compare these findings to other contemporary cemeteries, including Freedman's Cemetery, representing Dallas's early African-American population. You see a picture here of Freedman's Cemetery, and potentially the Joint Quartz Complex Alameda Stone Cemetery in Tucson, Arizona, was a large cemetery comprised of early Mexican Americans. So I would like to thank you for allowing me the time to give this presentation today, and I look forward to any further discussion in the panel this afternoon.
Fascinating report. We will now turn to our panel discussion led by moderator Dr. Maria Franklin, who is a faculty member with the Department of Anthropology at the University of Texas.
So I just would like to introduce our panelists for today, Dr. Kate Spradley, who just gave an excellent overview of what one can learn from bioarchaeological analysis. Brittany McLean with Amatera Environmental, who participated in the Oakwood excavation. We also have with us Brandon Young with Hicks Company. Hicks Company was responsible for permitting and the archaeological investigations. And we also have with us Dr. Brad Jones, who is the state archaeologist with the Texas Historical Commission. So welcome everybody to the panel. And I have a series of questions I'd like to pose to all of you. Starting with the first one, most people don't think of public cemeteries as sites where archaeology takes place. So why is it that archaeology took place here? How did archaeologists get involved with this project?
Do you want us to just jump in, or you want
Sure,
to call
go
on
ahead.
us?
Thank you, Dr. Jones. That'd be awesome.
Well, first I need to clarify that I'm not Dr. Jones. I'm only Master Jones. So I appreciate the promotion, Dr. Franklin. And if UT wishes to give me—
We gotta work on that. We gotta work on that. Okay.
Yes, I am the state archaeologist and the division director for the Texas Historical Commission. And I was not involved directly with this project. It occurred before I was in the position now, but I was with the THC. But from our perspective, the Texas Historical Commission operates under the Texas Antiquities Code. And the Texas Antiquities Code was written in 1969, and it protects all cultural resources on lands owned by the state of Texas. So in the case of Oakwood Cemetery, it's on the National Register. It is an archaeological site, and for us, an archaeological site is simply anything older than 50 years old, potentially. So it's subject to the Antiquities Code. So whenever any sort of construction or improvement project is going to happen on a property owned by the state, the landowning group is required to contact our agency and ask if they need to undertake archaeological investigations. With a site like the Oakwood Cemetery, with its age and just historical significance, we did ask and require that the city of Austin undertake archaeological investigations to ensure that any sort of actions they would take would not negatively impact cultural resources. In this case, of course, what we're talking about are burials, which are unmarked and invisible.
Right, right. Thank you very much, Brad. Brittany, can I ask you, since you were out at the site, what are the challenges of conducting archaeological excavations in cemetery contexts?
Wow, there are a lot of challenges. First, it's a lot of soil identification, really, and making sure that you can identify that. The burial seating, that was the key indicator in helping to locate where the graves were, the unmarked graves. And there's a difference in soil texture, as Dr. Spradley pointed out in her presentation. And so being able to identify that is key, and then going from there and excavating. So usually, like in pictures you see, you know, excavations are fun and you have wide open spaces. Well, now we were doing interior excavations within the chapel itself. So space was really confined, which posed a problem, but it's okay. We can contort ourselves into various positions. And then with this particular project, the chapel was built on existing burials. So some of those burials were bisected by the foundation themselves. So we had to do interior excavations and exterior excavations at the same time. So that was quite a challenge to be able to get a complete skeleton out, because this is a human. You need to be able to do everything as ethically as possible. So that was one of the main challenges, having to we had to tunnel under the foundation to get out the complete skeleton. Yeah, so.
Thank you for that. Thanks. When you're digging, maybe for the audience's sake, since they might not be familiar with it, you're using hand tools, is that correct? You're not digging with shovels, but what kind of tools are you using to excavate?
That's a great question. So we actually use really tiny wood tools, like wooden skewers that you could use for like food, and then wood clay working tools as well. We want to use wood because we don't want to damage any of the remains, and so that's why metal is kind of a no-go. So when we use hand trowels as well to scrape off the top layers of the soil as carefully as possible. And then once we identify bone, then we go from there and we use all wooden tools. So.
Great, thank you very much. You mentioned the ethics, and so I'd like to open it up to folks and ask, can you address the ethical concerns of excavating at cemeteries?
Well, I'd say, this is Brandon. I think that certainly there's ethical concerns, absolutely. They're sacred areas, essentially. These are the final resting places of men, women, and children. And as such, I don't know anybody that takes it very lightly at all. It's a very serious undertaking. And I think in terms of that, we've addressed these ethical concerns by laws that we have enacted to help protect cemeteries and individual graves, and that there's very specific and narrow procedures in which a cemetery would ever be disturbed. And so, for instance, in Texas, we have the Health and Safety Code, Chapter 711, which specifically deals with burials and the disposition of the dead. And so there's very few circumstances in which they are disturbed. It has to be something pretty extraordinary. And so I think that everyone involved in this takes the ethical concerns very seriously. Everybody has, the public in general has their own cultural and religious concerns and ideas about burials. And so that's how I look at it.
Would someone else like to comment on that question? Dr. Spradley?
Sure, I'm happy to comment on this. I wasn't really involved with the archaeology so much, but once the remains were transferred to our laboratory, but you know, you have to treat everybody with respect and dignity. And these were all individuals that were somebody's relative. So once they're in the lab, we all treat them, you know, as they were our own relatives, as we would want our own relatives to be treated. And, you know, being kept in a secure access laboratory is important for ethical considerations too. Not putting the remains where they're on display for just even the general student population. They were kept in an area of the lab that was, you know, somewhat secure from other students that weren't involved with the analysis. You know, following the best practices within the field of biological anthropology and bioarchaeology for data collection and analysis, and you know, conducting public outreach, keeping the public engaged, and then having community engagement for what happens with that data and who can use it, I think is important also.
I can jump on that. You know, since I was present in the field for that, I can assure you that everything was done to the you know, best of our abilities and in the most ethical way possible. I don't take it to heart, or well, I don't take it very lightly. Excavating human remains, we treat everybody, you know, as they should be, that we are giving them a voice. And you know, so following Dr. Spradley saying like best practices, so that would be like no photos being taken, just as much documentation as possible for future, you know, for doing, you know, lab analyses and stuff, and making sure the crew knows that this is, you know, a place that should be respected. So, yeah.
Thank you. Can we get a comment also from our state archaeologist on this?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, everything they've said is true. And I think it's important to recognize that we don't, I mean, I think there's a popular image of the archaeologist as someone who excavates graves, unfortunately. And the reality is we don't really like to do that. We do that as a sort of an act of last resort. Most archaeological investigations into cemeteries are designed to avoid, basically to identify burials which may be unrecognized, to avoid doing any damage to them. So, you know, at the root of our ethical idea is to avoid really doing archaeology in many ways, other than just this sort of identification level. So it's protecting and preserving in place is what we want to do. But there are special situations such as this where construction, once it's undertaken, it's, you know, there aren't many, there's only, you can either stop or you can proceed in the most ethical manner possible and by doing the least amount of harm. So, you know, you'll read in the report that not all the burials were excavated. There were areas of the property where they knew there were intact burials, but they went ahead and avoided it. So, you know, ethically, we want to shake that image that, you know, the old school image that archaeologists love to dig up graves, because I really don't think that's where the profession is at ethically at this moment in the way we practice.
Thank you.
I would say too, if you don't mind, I was going to say that kind of plays back into the challenges of working in the cemetery. I think is the perception that Brad is talking about, the perception of the public not understanding entirely what we do, and that is a last a chance. We don't want to dig a human burial up if we don't have to. We want to leave that alone. And so,
okay. Thank you. So I'll shift to asking now about what do you consider to be the most important result from the research and why? Maybe we can start with Kate.
That's a really big question there.
It is, yeah.
I think when you're dealing with this, you know, addressing who these individuals were, because they were largely unmarked. We didn't have, you know, there wasn't a headstone that said who this person was and what they died from. So if we can learn who they were, you know, I think that's really the first most important step. You know, just learning, you know, about the diversity of the cemetery, and learning the age distributions and the pathologies, and the fact that, you know, some people have trauma. And then, you know, the next thing will be, how does this compare to other contemporary cemeteries, to give us a glimpse of, you know, life during this time in Austin.
Great, great. Thank you. Others? What do you consider
think
to be the most important? Thank you, Brandon. Or was that
I
Brandon?
would think just stepping back one level would be that finding the 37 men, women, and children under the chapel where we didn't have any idea what we were going to encounter. I think that was really a shock and surprise to most people involved in the project. Yeah. And I think that in and of itself was stunning, quite honestly. So
can I ask you to elaborate on how do you think this happened then? I mean, what is your interpretation?
Well, I disappeared.
You're still here. I see you.
My thing disappeared.
Okay, I can hear you and see you.
Okay, I'll just continue. That's a very loaded question there. It's I think that we're dealing with a situation that it was a matter of context and time and history. At that particular time, for whatever reason, it was deemed okay to bury these individuals and then build a structure over them. That's tough. And I don't know if I want to go down that rabbit hole too far at this point, because I think it's a lot of, there's just a lot of history there that need to be dissected and taken apart.
I agree. Does anyone want to expand further on what Brandon brought up on why the chapel is on top of unmarked graves?
I don't know. I think it was probably a space issue and they did so knowingly, but I think the most important thing now is, righting the wrongs that happened, reparations from it, and giving these people a voice. And that's why the symposium is so great that we're doing this. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it wasn't, poor form. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't coincidence that they chose that section of the cemetery to build a chapel, right?
No, and if I could just add a little bit to that. So even present day, I work with marginalized communities. I work with migrants who die at the Texas-Mexico border. I work with a lot of unidentified people that are buried, not following the law. And what I found is that there have been structures placed over those burials. When a cemetery wants to build a new building, they did so on the unidentified section. I think this is, we see this over and over again in history. People that are marginalized are not looked at the same. And,
yeah, no.
This just repeats itself over and over again.
Absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. In this case, it was racist. Yeah, absolutely. And I think we need to own up to what happened. Were there any surprises? I mean, Brandon, of course, mentioned of when finding the burials themselves under the chapel was one obviously shocking thing that happened, but were there any other surprises or unexpected findings that came out of this research once you started excavating, once you started doing the analysis?
I would say, based on the preliminary archival research that had been provided, there was the thought that, okay, if there are graves here, they may be African-American based on the historic maps of the cemetery. Okay, so that there was a concern there for sure. But I think once we got the analysis results back, I think it was very surprising that we see a very mixed group of individuals. We see men, women, children, African-Americans, Hispanics, and white. I think that was a little surprising for folks as well. And I think that it kind of leads itself to, I think that it's been mentioned earlier today, that Austin was diverse and it's diverse today. So I think there's a certain parallel there that I find interesting.
Thank you. Other unexpected findings?
Well, I would like to say that I'm more of a Bayesian, and I like to work with informed priors. So I wouldn't say so much the analysis came out and surprised me, but when we did some research and downloaded the public records information and looked specifically who was buried in that section of cemetery, to see that it was, referred to as the colored ground, but also the stranger's ground, and then seeing that diversity within it at that point was surprising to me. But
right, yeah. Thank you.
I think another surprise was the lack of personal effects that were with the individuals, because I would have expected to maybe see more, but I think that may play into that these individuals were of lower socioeconomic status, which also infers why they were placed in where they were. So, and then later forgotten about, but yeah.
Yeah, Brittany, can you tell me a little bit more, since you've done other cemetery excavations? I mean, what kinds of personal possessions do you typically find that you thought that you might find at Oakwood?
Good question. I think, oh man, I think it depends on the context. So I've done prehistoric burials as well, in addition to historic burials. So for historic, I would say maybe more clothing artifacts, so more buttons, possibly like jewelry or rings, other maybe mementos that loved ones may have placed into the coffin with the individual, or maybe even more religious, personal like artifacts.
Right. So there was one religious artifact that was found, correct? Can you talk a little bit about what that was?
It was a small, I don't recall the material. Brandon, you may know, but the crucifix.
The porcelain.
Porcelain, yeah. So
Yeah.
that was the one religious personal effect that we found.
Yeah, yeah.
At least that we identified.
Correct, right. Yeah, that was whole enough, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And that was particularly touching because that was laid on the chest of a child.
Correct.
If I remember correctly. So
Yeah.
it was a very humanizing.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
exactly. So the burials have been dated. Can you explain to the audience how you were able to date the burials?
Yes, so you can date burials a variety of ways. So we know that the cemetery itself was established in 1839, and we know that the chapel was built in 1914. So that kind of gives you a small window of like when these people were interred. And then on top of that, you can look at some of the grave goods. I'm sorry, not the grave goods, but like the coffin nails, hand cut, like square nails. That gives you an indicator that is man-made. And that can give you a narrow time frame. In addition to buttons, they've been manufactured for a certain amount of time. That can narrow down the age range. What else? Yeah, just some of the like screws, coffin lining tacks. You can date those, so that kind of gives you some context.
Right, right.
And that goes with what we had more coffin materials than we had personal items, so it was much easier to date it, and that relatively dating in that regard.
Yeah, I noticed that the nails, there was mortuary, there was coffin hardware. Was there a difference in terms of the relative costs of the coffin hardware that might have suggested different individuals had different means, or at least their families or whoever was responsible for laying them to rest had varying means?
My thought on it was that if these were visitors to Austin and they died while they were here, or citizens of that didn't have the means to or family to claim them when they died. I mean, I'm looking at it like they didn't have a lot of materials, is what we're thinking. We didn't see a lot. I mean, I think what I see a lot of is it was the clothes they had on their backs. That's the type of materials you're getting out of the burial. Things like suspender buckles, things like that. It's just very common everyday materials, and some of those are harder to date. But,
to expand on that, what Brandon was saying, that we did see minimal coffin hardware, so it was just very basic things that held the coffin themselves together. In other cemeteries of like possibly higher socioeconomic status, you may see more elaborate hardwares on the coffin itself, in addition to coffin handles, which is something that we saw very few of in this cemetery or within this,
So it tended to underscore the point that this was a poorer population.
Right. I think if the city was responsible for burying these individuals, then yes, it wasn't. They couldn't spend as much money on all these individual people as it was a municipal undertaking. I think you look at it that way.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Spradley, you had started, I mean, in your talk, you touched on like the comparing the Oakwood series to Freedman Cemetery. Can you talk a little bit about what, how this particular group of individuals compared in terms of health or longevity or any other metric to other populations that you've studied?
Right, so that would be kind of the, where we go from here, and to look more specifically at it. And, we haven't gotten there yet, but I have looked at a lot of historic cemeteries, especially for underrepresented groups. And particularly in Memphis and in the Northeast. And this, I think this is very typical of the time period. There's not as much, pathology as I've seen in other places. There wasn't a lot of degenerative arthritis. People looked pretty good for the time and the age. You have a little bit of trauma, not a lot. So generally speaking, people were pretty healthy. And this was at a time when infectious disease was the leading cause of death, and infectious disease doesn't leave any marks on the bone. So, it looked like a somewhat healthy population.
Relatively speaking.
Relatively speaking, yes, absolutely relative. With the adults probably dying mostly from infectious disease.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask, you had alluded to it somewhat in your talk about why the report took so long to get out, but I'd like to open that up to the group as well to address what the process was, or what kind of challenges you faced in getting the report out.
So
Well, I'll just throw in that a long report time on a project of this scale is really common. And, we typically say things like, 10 to 1 field, one hour in the field for every 10 hours in the lab writing it up. So I think a lot of people don't, they're surprised by that, but most archaeology actually happens somewhere else than the archaeological site, because it's one thing to get the material out. It's another to appropriately clean it, to analyze it, and then to write it up and do the research. So there's really a lot of work that goes into it. So this is not a project that's, unusual in terms of what we see for testing or data recovery level projects like this.
Yeah, that's good. It's good to let folks who might not know that the field work is usually just that takes less time than the actual analysis and so forth. So I wanted folks to talk about a little bit about, what goes into getting all of the parts together to put together a report. Brandon, can you comment on that? Because I know you shepherded the report through to the end.
Yeah, I would say it's kind of a two-part answer. I think you've got the front end, which is the field, and then you've got the back end, which is the laboratory and the writing. I want to address both parts because it really affected the trajectory of this project, the schedule. There were a lot of unknowns when they went into excavations. So once the individual graves were starting to be identified, everything slowed down tremendously. Very meticulous handwork. And we're talking about excavating in 4-inch or less thick layers of soil by hand. All that generates a lot of paperwork. So there's a lot of data generated in the field. Then you get back to the lab on the back end, and you have to process that. You have to analyze it. You have to catalog the materials. You have to do the research. So like Brad said, it's a lot longer process than I think most people imagine, or maybe can't understand why it takes that long. But it really does. And it's just a lot of time. It's a lot of information that was generated from 37 interments.
Brittany, did you have something to add to that?
no, just that it takes a really long time. I thought the field work took a long time, but then the reporting, it just compiling all that information. There's so much information to record and document, just to make sure that the reporting goes as smoothly as possible, to give a lot of context also for provenience, meaning like where exactly it was within the burial, but also depth too, because that can play a large role in what the artifact may mean. you know, was it because of soil movement that this artifact is here, or was it actually like placed with the individual? So there's lots to record.
Right. Yeah. And can you just remind all of us, how long were you actually out in the field?
So I was in charge of the exhumations, and so I was a project archaeologist and then the lead bio-archaeologist as well. So I think we began at least the exhumation part of it in May, and it wrapped up in October. And then we did some additional monitoring work after that. So
months.
Yes, months.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Thank you. A number of burials were poorly preserved. Can you explain how this impacts what we can learn about these individuals? Anyone?
Yeah.
I guess
Maybe you could do it
We've got two bioarchaeologists here. So.
Yeah, soil, man, that's really important. That really affects the condition of the remains. So when they initially identified that there were existing burials below the chapel, then it took a lot of permitting and figuring out what's going to happen. So the top layers of the soil were just, you know, left out in the open, which hardens after a while, and then that makes it really difficult to get down to those burials in a timely fashion. But on top of that, in I believe 1944, there were some renovations that happened. Maybe some concrete was poured or something, and that kind of trickled down into the soil. So it was like very hard, you know, clayey, concretey. And then when you finally get to the remains themselves, this was encased in like a silty clay, I believe, and that adheres to the bone. So it makes it really hard to excavate. It sticks to the bone, but also when that clay dries out, it makes it to where it's very difficult to pull out the bone in complete elements. And so that's when it gets to what Dr. Spradley is seeing, just very fragmented remains, just because of the soil condition, and then also water plays a big role too. So luckily, since it was in the chapel, it was shielded from water, rain, you know, the elements in that way, but that still doesn't protect it completely. So.
Right, and I could just follow up with that and say with that poor preservation, you know, even after we clean everything and we lay everything out in anatomical position, which does take a long time, it still takes even longer. If you have a complete skeleton and you have a whole pelvis, it's pretty easy to ascertain if the person is male or female. But when you have a really crushed, fragmented pelvis, it's a lot harder to get that information. So you have to dig deeper and use different methods and use multiple methods, not just one. You know, the pelvis is the best estimator of sex because there's differences between males and females, but then you may have to go with multiple measurements from long bones all over the body, and then an assessment from the crania if there's any cranial fragments. So it takes a lot longer, and it's harder to get that information. And, you know, everything we do is an estimation. None of it is, you know, 100%. So it makes some of those estimations, you know, moderate, or not as strong as if there was more of the remains there.
Okay, thank you for explaining that to us. So my next question is about, I mean, it's not really clear how these individuals were, you know, why they were laid to rest in that section of the cemetery, especially since it was colored, considered the colored grounds. And clearly not everybody was African-American who was laid to rest there, which leads to different kinds of hypotheses about why they're buried there. Do any of you have some insights as to how you think these specific individuals ended up being buried in that section of the cemetery?
I could speak to that a little bit. So it's when it says colored ground, I think that for one meant non-white, and Mexicans weren't considered white at that time too. And you see that demographic in Austin and in Texas at the time. And then in the cemetery records I came across too, there was, you know, it kind of vacillated. You see the record keeping, and the data was not normalized. People use different terminology for that section. And I think over time you see some people use stranger's ground too. So it could also, I think, mean non-local as well. Or just some thoughts I have there.
Yeah, other thoughts?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think that what we're seeing is, I think we have local Austin citizens that couldn't afford burials or didn't have family or friends that could and didn't claim them. And I think we had visitors to Austin that died while they were here and again didn't have friends or family to claim them. And so the city was responsible for interring these individuals. And I think that that's where they chose to do it. And that's why we have this varied population in that part of the cemetery.
Other thoughts about that? So you think it could be a mix of locals and people who are visiting the city?
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Right. Brad, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, you know, this is an old cemetery, and in 1839, this is a pretty rural, you know, this is a frontier area. Austin is not the Austin we think of today. So I think, you know, I have two thoughts about it, neither of which are particularly well informed, but kind of coming up as I'm thinking. And, you know, I mean, we use the term colored section for that, but, you know, this starts before slavery ends. So, you know, it might be more appropriate to think of it as, and I think this was mentioned in the report, the Potter's Field, or more of a pauper's cemetery or a lower class cemetery. So, you know, I think you have to consider that, you know, and whether or not, and honestly, I'm reading the questions, and I know Dale Flatt mentioned that Bob Tiemann potentially is responsible for giving that section that name at some point in history. So I think you really have to look at the question of how it got named. I mean, that's a research question in and of itself. And, you know, I was thinking earlier when you were talking about the types of graves you find, having worked at some frontier settlements across Texas, you know, supply-wise, this place isn't well supplied. So a lot of times the lack of material culture might be as much a, you know, expression of just daily life out here without a lot of access to the sorts of goods that maybe you would see in a New York City cemetery of the same period or something else. So, you know, there's really a lot of factors going in here that could be shaping why the burial population we see is what it is.
Yeah, most people don't think of, you're right, most people don't think of Austin, even in the 1800s, as, we tend to think of it as highly urbanized at that point.
You know, read those early descriptions about the capital. Is, you know, not a pretty place.
Right. Well, let me see if Laura Esparza has some questions from the audience that she wants to pose.
Yes, I sure do. First of all, there's a question for Brad Jones. Does a THC receive many antiquities permits that deal with exhumations?
It's somewhat of a complicated answer. We only permit projects on state lands. So we do not receive very many antiquities code permitted projects for exhumations. A handful every year at the most. I mean, it's been interesting in the past few years. We've had a number of high profile cemetery investigations, such as the Sugar Land 95 and work in other places. So, but in reality, we don't get a lot of exhumation permitting requests. There are probably more exhumations that happen across the state under federal regulatory structures where we're involved as a participant, but we're not actually permitting it. So I realize it's a very kind of wonky answer, but you know, that's the reality of it. And like I said earlier, you know, we typically try to avoid impacting graves to the level where we have to exhume them. So it really is not a common situation.
Right.
There's a question for Dr. Spradley in particular. In terms of bioarchaeology, how can you determine the difference between a person of Mexican descent and a Native American person, since Mexican people often have Native American backgrounds?
That's a great question, and it can be very difficult to do so. And you're dealing with two population groups that have similar population histories in terms of European admixture as well to some extent. So you know, I think it would be difficult. What made the affinity estimation here Mexican was the a priori knowledge that the individuals buried in this cemetery were considered Black, white, or Mexican. So they were compared against these groups. If you look at all of the Oakwood Cemetery records, you see one person that's listed as Native American and one person that's listed as Asian. It wasn't a comparison of, oh, is this person Native American or Mexican? It was, which of these three groups, which one is, is the individual most similar to one of these three groups here? Because otherwise it could be very difficult to answer that question.
I think this next question may have been discussed already, but if there's anything anyone would like to add, if section 4 was considered the colored grounds or the stranger grounds, what was the historical reasoning behind why there were so many whites buried there?
I think it goes back to what Brad mentioned about it possibly being a pauper's grave situation, where you're burying people that didn't have the means or the family to take care of it for them.
The next question is, how common is it to find personal effects buried with individuals? Do wealthier individual burial sites, what kinds of things might be found in their burial sites?
Good question. Yes, it is common. I think it depends on the context as well, depending on lower socioeconomic status versus more affluent people. And with possibly more affluent individuals, you could see hairpins or combs, sometimes plaques on top of the coffin themselves that end up, the wood deteriorates and then the coffin plaque itself just kind of stays on top of the individual. That's been interesting. And then with, as we stated before, people with lower socioeconomic status, they don't have a lot of means. So you may not see as many personal effects as you would with more affluent people. So like buttons, maybe belt buckles, suspenders. We did find one individual who had a gold band on their finger, still in situ. And that was, I believe, one of the only pieces of jewelry that we found. So
yeah.
Yep.
All right. How do you feel about the role of the descendant community in deciding what analysis should be done?
I'll go ahead and say, I think it's important to engage with the descendant community and have them guide this practice. I'm sure that these cemeteries like this are rare, and I'm sure there's going to be people that want to study the data and the information that came out of here. And I think there should be some type of review board that incorporates the community, and so it can be community guided, and that answers that the community have can be addressed, and not just that the researchers have.
Great. The next question, is it difficult to control your emotions when unearthing infants or even other individuals? How do you cope with your feelings?
I wouldn't say that. I think it goes back to like respect and the ethics behind it. We treat every burial with respect, and it is very sad to see infants or sub-adults in a burial context. But I think back then it was the mortality rate of those individuals was a lot higher than the adults at times. And so we do see sub-adults quite often. And I think you just kind of, you excavate them as respectfully as you can. And I don't have any children myself, so I don't have that emotional guiding force behind that. But yeah, it is, I mean, it's interesting to excavate because you're like, wow, this is somebody from the past, and you're like giving them a voice again and bringing their, you know, story, like you could see their story unfolded on their remains, and then in addition to, you know, what they have with them. So yeah, it's, you know, it's not joyful.
One question wanted to know, do we really know when these bodies were probably buried?
Well, we have a set amount, a period of time between 1839 and 1914. So we have a pretty good idea, actually, as far as that sort of dating goes. We've got the period bookended pretty well.
Mm-hmm. All right. So that covers all of our questions. Thank you, panel. Thank you, moderator. We're so happy that you were here.
Thank you for having us.
This is very important information for the public to be able to see and hear. And so in order to accommodate some of the folks who have been trickling in through the course of the first 4 sessions, we're going to go ahead and take the recording of this session and post it on the Parks Department's YouTube page tonight. And so if you missed the first sessions, you can visit the Parks Department's YouTube page after 8 o'clock tonight and see the first 4 sessions, sessions 1 through 4. There were some comments about some of the print was looking a little fuzzy on our Zoom screens. Be assured that that information is in the report that is now posted on the Oakwood Cemetery Chapel's website. And so you can see those charts again in the exhumation and bioarchaeology report on the city's Oakwood Cemetery Chapel website. We are going to adjourn for lunch, but if you're like me, you like to watch videos while you dine. And so we're going to begin with a series of videos that were created by Oakwood Cemetery Chapel staff. We have some from community members. Fred McGee has a video, as well as colleagues at the Avondale Cemetery. So if you really would like to spend some more time exploring, we'll begin our video cavalcade of various videos that have been created about this topic. And we'll see you back here at 6 o'clock. Thank you for coming.